Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses with a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability. Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. Find out more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at Kyndryl.com. Imagine a history book looking back at the period from 2015 to 2025. What would be the core story, the theme of the chapter? The relentlessly lingering COVID-19 pandemic and the political backlash against vaccinations, perhaps? The most significant cross-border war in Europe since World War II, in parallel with catastrophic and horrific violence in the Middle East. The weakening and potential collapse of an almost 80-year-old alliance, the seemingly sudden rise of generative artificial intelligence technologies, with an impact on everything from employment to dating to political stability, the rapid spread and empowerment of oligarchy and authoritarianism, and the simultaneous breakdown of democratic norms, the acceleration of climate emergency with its succession of fires, storms, and hottest years ever so far, the metastatic growth of economic inequality both within and between nations, or the cordyceps-like infection of social media into every facet of our lives. Now, how about all these things happening at the exact same time? Today's book offers a language to make sense out of a world that is changing in ways that the old terminology can no longer capture. The BANI Framework, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible, is that new language. Brittle, recognize fragility in systems and strategies to build resilience. Anxious, address widespread anxiety and empathy and attentiveness. Nonlinear, navigate unpredictable scenarios with adaptive thinking. Incomprehensible, find clarity in overwhelming complexity. And then there's positive BANI, reframe the chaos into actionable opportunities for growth. It's a pleasure to welcome back friends of the show, previous guests and authors of Navigating the Age of Chaos, a sense-making guide to a BANI world that does not make sense. Bob Johansen, welcome back.
Thank you.
Jamais Cascio, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you, man. Last time we spoke, you were writing this, and we were doing a preview as well, so congrats on getting it over the line. It's been a while.
It has.
It's been a while in the pipeline. So before we started, I thought we'd give a bit of context. First of you two guys, how you know each other, and how the book came about.
Well, let's see. Bob and I have known each other now for getting close to 20 years because he and I met through the Institute for the Future, where I've been a research fellow, a research member, and then later a distinguished fellow. And Bob was your president for a while. And
Correct.
Now is currently a distinguished fellow as well. But basically, we've worked together on a number of projects. And I always look up to Bob because he's one of the few people taller than me at the Institute. So, but in reality, I greatly look up to Bob and the work that he's done, the expertise, and it's frankly the empathy that he shows, not just for the planet, but also for the people that he works with on a day-to-day basis. I was really looking forward to getting a chance to work with him on this, and here we go.
And I have to add to that as well, because I told you off air as well, Bob was very kind to me when I wrote my first book. Reddit also encouraged me, said, you know what, you're a sense maker, keep doing what you're doing. So from both of us, Bob, respect to you, brother.
Thank you.
And Bob, what about your interactions with Jamais over the years?
So Jamais is the best scenario writer I've ever worked with. So the tasks we do together have often involved scenarios. I have in my previous books over the last 20 years used the term VUCA a lot for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I'm not a military guy by background, but I just happened to be at the Army War College where that term was coined. I just happened to be there the week before 9/11 and was introduced to this term VUCA, which for me was an excellent way to frame the future for a period of time. And I began then teaching there, and I still teach there. I work with the new 3-star generals. They read the same book we're going to be talking about. And then we talk about strategy and talk about leadership. And when Jamais introduced me to the BANI concept, that began a dialogue. And I must admit, at first I said, why do we need this? We got VUCA. That's enough. But then I've realized, and this is really important, I've realized that VUCA isn't VUCA enough for what we're about to face.
That's for sure. And I have a little quote here that actually speaks to that. You said in the book, the ability to act now to achieve a consciously intended but currently unrealized outcome goes at least as far back as early Homo sapiens. Cognitive scientists refer to this as causal cognition, a recognition of cause and effect processes, and the ability to make usable forecasts as to future results or present actions. It appears to have evolved around the same time as our ability to throw with accuracy at a moving target. Both of these are abilities that no other primates have, including our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. The ability to imagine the future is intrinsic to what makes us human. But this is the thing. This is why we struggle when patterns are not repeatable. And this is a nice segue then to how VUCA became not VUCA enough. And as you say in the book, R.I.P. VUCA.
Well, I first came up with the BANI framework in 2018. And it was part of a larger presentation I was giving to Institute for the Future on the future of trust in the international system. And I've done I actually have a graduate degree in international politics. And so I've been deeply immersed in theories of international relations for quite some time. And there's a persistent idea that the international system is anarchic, which means that it has no top-down authority. But a lot of people confuse anarchy and chaos. And over the course of this talk, I really tried to tease out why they were different, but also why we were increasingly moving towards chaos. What I was seeing in 2018 was a world where the technology was getting weirder, where the politics, this was 2 years into the President 45, and it was already getting really weird. And it just seemed like it was time for some new language. And I have to admit, there was polite applause in the audience when I gave that presentation, except from the Brazilians who loved the idea because it spoke to what they were already experiencing. And so when COVID hit and people encouraged me to make the BANI idea public, and I wrote the piece on Medium in April of 2020, the folks in the developing world were far and away the first to see the value of the BANI framework and to understand really what it felt like and what it meant. So, and that's one of the key differentiators, I think, for BANI versus VUCA, is that BANI really looks at what it feels like to live in a world of chaos. It has a very human-centered approach. What is this experience of living in a chaotic system?
And what we've also found with VUCA is that there was an assumption, a kind of basic, unexamined assumption, that if only we could find the right data, if only we could find the right expert, we'd actually be able to understand what was going on. And it's important to realize VUCA was coined in the late 1980s, so it was a post-Cold War term. It was a time when we were much more optimistic about science and about technology than right now. We realize we're still heavily committed to technology and science, but it's much more of a mixed blessing than it was then. We were really optimistic in that period compared to where we are now. Where in the BANI framework, what I've realized and what caused me to want to write this book with Jamais is that the BANI framework does not assume that we'll be able to understand what's going on, but we still have to have the sense-making ability to act, even if it doesn't make sense. So it's that kind of dilemma that we're dealing with. And the conversation that led to this book was, I still remember the conversation, Jamais and I talking about, well, how do we use BANI framework not only as a way of describing what we're experiencing now, but flipping it positive?
I think it's important to say as well, Bob, you said about that, do we need this? When you said that, do we need this? But again, people won't understand what it's just an acronym. And what I felt was, I remember that quote by Wittgenstein, which is the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And that as we evolve, so too must our language. And I think it's important. I'd love you to share that piece before we get into it.
Exactly. So, yeah, Wittgenstein's kind of the root of this concept, but it goes into people like Irving Goffman at Penn talked about frames theory and framing. We have no choice when we think about the future. We have no choice but to have a frame. The only choice we have is whether it's conscious or not. And one of the big lessons from our work at Institute for the Future is if you frame the future correctly, it draws you toward a more preferable future, and it helps you be more future ready. But if you frame the future inaccurately, or you pretend that you don't have any frame, you're just not going to be as ready. You're not going to be as able to pursue your preferred future. So really the beginning of BANI is framing. How do you want to frame the future? And we think this is just a dramatically better way to frame the future than what we've had previously.
One of the things you say, and Jamais, I'd love you to expand on this. I thought of this as a positive interlude because there's studies done on people that when you go, do you want the good news or the bad news first? With those studies, 78% of people give me the bad news first to get it out of the way. So with this book, less than half of it is written in BANI, which is the difficult to read, and it is difficult to read part of the book because it talks about a lot of crises we have had, but also that are coming our way regardless of what we do. And how, in a way, I thought of that concept of the Red Queen race, that we're running faster and faster to stay still because no matter what we do, we've gone past the point of no return with a lot of these things. And that was difficult for someone who, for me, I tried to live in the positive side of things, but it was difficult. And I think this is one of the things you say, and this is why this paragraph stood out. You said, the most difficult part of thinking about the BANI future is not letting the intensity and abundance of the chaos turn into fear, anger, or anticipatory capitulation. It's easy to look at the scope and scale of the chaotic forces we'll be grappling with and decide it's all too big, too overwhelming, just too much. Honestly, you may well be right to think that way. The hardest part of doing foresight work, whether as a profession or just as a task, is taking in the multiplicity of risks and absurdities without seeing everything as doom. And I thought that was important because both of you, working as futurists, working with the Institute of the Future, you've given many, many talks. And part of that futurism is to call out realities. But often you're framed as a doomsayer instead of a gainsayer. And I thought we'd call that out early on in our conversations.
Well, I do get, people do often refer to me, even at Institute for the Future, refer to me as a doomsayer. It's because I don't know, maybe I'm just making it sound so beautiful with my lovely voice. But it really is I do try to approach this not as a sense of, not from the perspective of, you're doomed, it's all going to end soon, but really from a sense of, okay, we're doomed. What are we going to do about it? It's stating the challenges, stating these not as inevitable catastrophes, but as ongoing challenges. They push us to get better.
That's the challenge, and that's what motivated us. The reason we reached out to our co-author, Angela Williams, is to try to look for on-the-ground examples. Because as Jamais said, there's parts of the world, like climate impact zones, like war zones, a number of parts of the world where BANI's already here. It's just not evenly distributed around the world. And we brought in Angela. Angela is the first woman, the first African-American to be the CEO of United Way Worldwide. So she has a global perspective. She's an ordained minister. She's also a military person. She's also a lawyer by training. So she has this rich background of service and of on-the-ground experience. And that's what we were looking for. So what Jamais and I were providing were the future back view. What Angela provides is more the present forward view. And then we've got a whole chapter on leadership. We've got a whole series, 4 chapters on flipping BA.N.I positive. So our goal was to give people a language, a new frame and a language that helps them describe what they're experiencing and what they're likely to experience even more intensely over the next decade and beyond. But also, and this is really important, also, how can you engage and flip this into something positive?
It reminded me of the usage of BANI, and you talk about, well, it helps because it gives us a seed for narratives. It gives us a way to just frame.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of the Einstein quote that he said, if I had 60 minutes to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes on the question, 5 minutes on the answer.
Yes.
Because the understanding why BANI is important is also important how to understand BANI plus the positive BANI side. So let's get stuck in, because as I said, 78% of people want the bad news first. We'll get stuck in. And I thought what I'd do was have a little quote on each of the 4 letters, the acronym, and I'll tee that up, and then we'll dip in and out of the chapters of those. In part 1, for those who are joining us for the 2 parts, we're going to do BANI, and then we're going to do BANI plus as part 2. But you really need to understand BANI to understand what BANI plus is about. So let's get stuck into Brittle. So in a brittle world, what we believe about the reliability of systems, technologies, and people fails us. We imagine that the world around us works as described, only to find out that we've come to rely on fragile monocultures, interdependent entanglements, and even hyper-efficient process in which everything must always work exactly right. And this goes back to that idea that we're trained to hope for a good future. When that doesn't pan out the way we thought, we are anxious and we struggle very, very badly. So let's get stuck into Brittle.
Brittle is the idea that things can look strong, can even function well until they fail catastrophically. And it's a very abrupt shift. It's not that kind of gradual, graceful failure that we hope to see is when something breaks down. It's just everything's plugging along and then suddenly it blows up. And we've seen this happen with a number of different systems, both at a small level and at a global level. We saw a lot of it coming out of COVID with trade routes and supply chains breaking down. We see it happening with democracy around the world. Systems that we have come to rely upon just seem to stop working. Sometimes it's because they're overstressed. Sometimes it's because it's the underlying technologies or underlying conditions have shifted. Sometimes it's just because we try to be super efficient. That's actually something I've been paying a lot of attention to over the years, is just that tension between resilience and efficiency. You have plenty of systems out there that we have pushed just-in-time manufacturing. We have pushed and pushed and pushed to make sure that everything runs just as tight as possible. And when it works beautifully. It's really profitable. But when it fails catastrophically. One piece comes in late. One factory breaks down and suddenly the whole system blows up. Similarly, we see with the use of monocultures. Monocultures are very efficient. We see that, people growing stands of trees that are all clones of the same, not just the same species, but the same individual, because that individual has the best wood pulp or whatever. And that's great. That means every single tree is coming out with the exact right kind of material until that one bug shows up, that fungus or the bacteria shows up, and it wipes out the entire stand of trees because one particular individual happened to be vulnerable to that infection. And the idea that we need to be, the resilience means being less efficient is anathema to a lot of people, because it asks us not to be as profitable, asks us not to be as quick, but it asks us to be more reliable. And so we have a systems growing around us, physical and metaphysical, that are so dependent upon everything working correctly, so dependent upon everything working precisely, that any failure along the way ends up being something truly, truly dangerous. The example we use in the book is the CrowdStrike incident from 2024, where, because this one particular security system failed, they failed in doing a small update to the security system, and that had a cascading effect of bringing down literally millions of computers around the world. And these computers were not just accounting devices. They were used to control the National Health Service. They were used to schedule flights. And so you had literally tens of millions of people around the world unable to get an ambulance, unable to get their flight. And this is something that costs billions of dollars, even though the outage was for just about a day. But it actually also cost lives, all because somebody didn't do an update quite right. That's little change, that little blip, that little piece of brittleness caused the entire system to collapse. And we've seen this time and again. And this is something that, like I said, I've been writing about brittleness and resilience for quite some time. And that was one of the drivers when I first talked about BANI, is just seeing these kinds of collapses happening, and society as a whole, not just American society, but global society, is just not doing anything about it. And it's a lot of frustration went into the creation of BANI, just because, like I say, sometimes I feel that I'm going to have on my headstone, "I told you so." It's just this feeling that these things are breaking up and we're not willing to look at it. And so BANI was an attempt to make people look at it.
I think it's so hard when you think about things like infrastructure. It's so hard to think about how to prepare for things going wrong, because we spend so much of our effort trying to figure out how to make them as fast as possible. And the vivid story that I think of about Brittle is the Francis Scott Key Bridge over Baltimore Harbor, where it was a beautiful, expansive bridge, and it looked really strong, but there's very little attention in the U.S. paid to bridges anymore. I mean, they were really cool when we were building them, but maintaining them is just not a priority. So we've got all these sometimes very pretty, and they look very strong bridges, but when the cargo ship Dolly rammed the Francis Scott Key Bridge, it didn't just break, it shattered. It shattered. And we're surprised. So we've got so much infrastructure like that in the U.S. And it isn't just physical structure, it's conceptual infrastructure, maybe even things like democracy that look strong, but they're not as strong as they look. And right now we have relatively little incentive to think future back. So part of what Jamais and I are doing is saying, hey, we got to think future back in order to be more prepared for what we're about to face.
So I don't know if you remember in the Iraq War in 2003, 2004, Condoleezza Rice was the national security advisor. And she was asked about whether or not they had plans for what to do if the particular offensive or particular strategy failed. And she looked aghast to be asked that question. She said, "It is irresponsible to think about failure when you're trying to succeed." And that just struck me as both horribly wrongheaded and entirely emblematic of the conventional wisdom in America, in particular, in the West in general, I think, around that kind of thinking, around planning and scenarios and recognizing the possibility that things aren't going to turn out the way you want them to.
For me, it reminded me of the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. Because
yes,
the story is we had one type of potato. We had this Irish lumper potato, and 150 types of species of potato exist in places like South America. They planted various types in case one of them got taken down, that the whole thing didn't get taken down. So that came to mind as I read about Brittle as well, which is, I mean, it's not nice reading about this thing because it makes you question a lot of things. And to your point, about, and I'm picking up some of Bob's other books here for those people who are just listening to us. The new leadership literacies and full spectrum thinking. And Bob talks about that idea of future back. And also Jamais writes a lot about scenario planning. And one of the things that came to mind was there was a book written by JFK called Profiles in Courage, and like a book that very few people have read because it's about political figures who made choices that were not popular but really important. And it reminded me of stuff that you talked in the book, like the Spanish flu, because I saw an interview with Obama, and it was actually a speech he was giving, and he said we need to put in place structures for the Spanish flu. And nobody listens to those things because we want short-term returns on things. It's like insurance policies. You're like, hey, if I can get away with without getting an insurance policy is actually sometimes people's strategy versus, well, I better put it in place. I'd love you to expand on that, because it's that decision to make these really important decisions. And this goes for organizations as well with innovation. Do I keep squeezing out every penny today, or do I try and plant a few seeds and hopefully some of them will come on for the future?
I did a custom forecast for a very large insurance company, the CEO of a very large insurance company, a few years back. And if you think about the whole idea of insurance, it's indemnification if after something bad happens. And most people in most societies nowadays, we're gamblers. And the fact that gambling is taking off in the U.S. in ways that it never had before, it's not just a coincidence, but it's very worrisome, because it's like we're willing to gamble our future. When we did this custom forecast, we were suggesting to the insurance company, well, how about if you not just play the indemnification game? How about if you play the preparedness game and the readiness game? So instead of insuring a house, if the pipes break, you put in sensors on the pipes, so that if a leak forms, the sensors pick it up and you never do have a flood, as compared to gambling the risk. And it's really a different business model. But to me, it makes a lot of sense, where you're trying to figure out, well, how do we avoid bad things happening and turn that into a business? It could be a very profitable business to be prepared, but we're just not used to it. We're gamblers. And if you're a conscientious gambler, you get an insurance policy. If you're a crazy gambler with an addiction, you just take the risk.
In many ways, insurance does really exemplify a lot of what we're talking about, and not just with Brittle. Because one of the aspects of insurance is that it is designed to spread the risk among many people. So It's not just a case of I'm saving up money just in case there's an accident. I'm getting involved in a system where what I pay into this pot is available to everyone else in the system in case there's an accident or in case there's a problem somewhere. And the more people you have in the system, the more resilient and more robust it is, because there's still you're still going to find that there's a lot more people who are getting by just fine than people who are suffering, and under most circumstances. And so we have a lot of resistance to many of these ideas in the United States in particular, but I think more broadly in the West in general. Trying to push back is because we're rugged individuals. We're trying to push back. We are in control of our own lives, when in reality we are far more resilient, far more able to continue in a healthy way if we are connected with others. And so I know we're jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the positive BANI ideas is interconnectedness is the counter to incomprehensibility. But that interconnectedness, it really is a very large concept, and it plays into so much of what we're talking about in the world of BANI. And the brittleness aspect, we are far more brittle when we are isolated. We are much more resilient when we're connected.
Well said, well said. And It's a nice segue actually for the next part, because it's one of the reasons I think that the BANI Plus side is so important. And a lot of them are about you. They're about you as a person. It's not just about organizations and the world being BANI Plus. It's actually us as individuals, because one of the biggest things that we see is a huge uptick in many, many illnesses of despair. And I hadn't heard about this term before, the diseases of despair. And this is the A of BANI, which is anxious. And you say, in an anxious world, our belief about our ability to shape and control outcomes faces increasingly complex technologies and ideologies built to deceive us. Revelation of that loss of control can mean hopelessness and despair. At the same time, our media hijacks basic cognitive processes to make us consume more, click more. We start to see every decision as potentially disastrous, and the more we learn about the world, the worse it all feels. Political systems, economic systems, environmental systems, the dynamic that makes the world work are running amok, and our illusion of control is gone. And I mentioned to you both, I'm writing a book at the moment, and one of the reasons I'm writing it is because of this, because I lecture to students and I've seen flickers of this anxious world from those students. And then on top of that, we see a huge amount of depression, and worse with younger generations as well. So maybe you'll take us through Anxious. And it's probably one of the more difficult chapters to read, Anxious, but we have to cover it.
It was painful writing that chapter. I don't know if you felt that pain as well, Bob, but for me, it was, the examination of what people are going through, the on-the-ground results of these mechanisms that, once again, are designed to carve out as much short-term profit as possible in most cases. Mechanisms that are intended to give people the sense of illusion of power, but actually make them powerless. It is just so demoralizing to think about that kind of stuff. And, we try to be upfront with people in the book that this is not going to be an easy chapter to read, because so much of it feels directed at us. And in fact, one of the, I had a lot of conversations with people in the production of the book. I had a lot of conversations with people around the world who've been using BANI in their work. And far and away, anxious is the part of BANI that most quickly and deeply resonates for them. They can see that happening. And yes, it's especially bad with younger people, but it's not just younger people. We see these kinds of diseases of despair happening with older middle-aged adults who recognize that everything they've put their life into is meaningless, or they've been fooled all along. I think there's a persuasive argument that one of the reasons why particular political pathologies have held on so tightly in the United States is because of people being unwilling to admit publicly that they're wrong, that they've been wrong and they've been fooled. And so you have on top of that a whole technology base that is predicated upon triggering our, eliciting our most immediate response to things. And it turns out that for a variety of good evolutionary reasons, our brains respond more quickly to fear and anger than they do to joy and happiness. And so you have these systems that are built to elicit that, to trigger that anger response, because it makes you click, makes you respond. And, like springs, clicking things makes the recipient money. And I don't think it is an intentional evil so much as it is a logical consequence of how we have constructed our socioeconomic system. And we don't dive deeply into that part in the book, because we really want to focus on what it feels like and what we can do to alleviate that feeling, or at least to moderate that feeling. But it's really important to remember that this is not something that is happening completely organically. It's because it is happening because somebody is profiting from it, whether it's profiting economically or profiting politically, profiting socially. And this sense of having that control taken away, having that power taken away, of not having any good choices left. That is such a pervasive feeling globally that it is, in many ways, I think the anxious is the heart of at least the first half of the book.
As you say, it's the engine of BANI, and the concept of if it bleeds, it leads came to mind here as well, which is a concept from the media. Bob, I saw you taking a few notes there. I'm sure you were organizing your thoughts.
Yeah, it's so interesting as we reflect on this, just to say, what are the things that touch people? And I think this notion that Jamais just mentioned of no good choices left, that's the root of anxiety, when you feel like you have no good choices left. So part of what we're trying to do in this book is to help people essentially give them a safe place to realize that's what's going on. And then secondly, in the BANI positive, figuring out how to give them choices, how to flip those negatives positive. And the good news is there's lots of resources to do that. It's just the resources have not been brought to bear in the ways that they need to, particularly for kids. And actually, if you read the research carefully, it's particularly for young men, not just young women. And it's just a fascinating and sometimes tragic dynamic of anxiety, the way it's applying to a number of different people across the age spectrum, across the business spectrum, across the intellectual spectrum.
Bob, I know I'm jumping ahead to BANI Plus here, but with the A,
it's hard not to. It's
yeah. Well, you're trying to keep. I'm trying to balance out a little bit of the anxiety here. But another A is Alan Watts, and I share your love of his work, and I still listen to him, and he encourages me so much listening to his work. And the reason I share that is he wrote about anxiety in the 60s, and he wrote about anxiety in the 60s as if it was a BANI time then. And I just wanted to point that out because every period has its own version of this. Every
right.
generation has its own period of this. We
right.
don't know. Well, we didn't live through the 40s, through the wartime, and in a way, that should be kept alive. There's a term in Germany, a Jewish artist put across Germany these little stones called Stolpersteiner, and what they're stumbling stones, and on each name there's written the name of a Jewish person who was murdered in the concentration camps. And he said it's not about shame, it's about a reminder that we need to remind ourselves of these times. But on the flip side, on the positive side, I also wanted to say something that Jamais opened up with, which was that we are resilient. We are resilient. At one stage there was 20,000 pairs of mating humans left on the planet, and we came back from these near extinction moments. So we have got it in us, but we need a wake-up call.
Yeah, it was interesting and startling as we were writing. It was making me remember, I went to divinity school before I did my PhD and studied world religions, and Alan Watts, the Zen Buddhist mystic of the time, was one of my favorite authors exploring Eastern religions. And he wrote this book called The Age of Anxiety, and it was the 1960s. So I still have, when I do talks, there's usually, in business audiences in particular, there's one person who rather snidely, after I've introduced BANI, says, "Oh, this is nothing new. We've had this all the time." And there's some truth to that. There's some truth to that argument. So I always have to be patient and have to listen to it. And yes, at some level, let's just start with VUCA. Life is a VUCA world. Life is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it always has been, beginning from the fact that we have to die. We all have to die at an uncertain time. So that's VUCA. Yes. Okay. Let's get that aside. But if you read these first 4 chapters, there's something different here happening around BA.N.I. at a global scale with climate disruption, at a technical scale with artificial intelligence, in a connectivity with cyber warfare, the kind of downside of connectivity. There's stuff happening now that, yes, echoes the 60s and echoes life itself. But this is different. This is different. And it's going to take a different mentality to engage with it.
One thing that we say early in the book is that pretty much every one of the issues that we talk about in the book and the people have spoken about more broadly around BA.N.I. are things that we've thought about, that people have thought about, have gamed out, have written policy papers on, but very rarely in combination. We're so accustomed to thinking about these as isolated issues that we sometimes forget just how multiplicative they can get. They basically become the ways of exponentiating the other problems that are going on, making them worse and worse and worse. You can't deal with climate without thinking about what we're doing with AI or with computers in general. You can't think about surveillance without thinking about demographics. All of these things that are each one of them a crisis become in combination overwhelming. And more, add to that in many of these cases, there are no solutions. There are only sets of responses, some better, some not so good, but none of them perfect. And, so that for me is what makes this era, worthy of being given its own name.
Yeah, it's the fact that these things are happening simultaneously, which is the real challenge. It reminded me of, there's the famous story of a guy called Clyde Beatty. He was the first ever lion tamer famous for not getting eaten in the ring. And his trick was, he was the guy who discovered the value of the chair. And when he held up the chair, the lion froze. And the reason the lion froze was because it tried to focus on all 4 legs of the chair at once, and it didn't have the cognitive capacity to deal with that. So it saw them as 4 separate threats. And I thought of that. I was like, I don't know how many legs chair are pointing at us today, but the human capacity is 7 plus or minus 2, a famous paper by George Miller. I think that's part of it. If you're a leader of a country or a leader of an organization, there's so many things to deal with simultaneously. And by the time, it's like the Hydra, by the time you lop off the head of one, it doubles, and you have this other 2 things to do over there, and it's nonstop. And that's, I think, what I related to with BA.N.I, because I was an early user of BA.N.I as well, or it helped me frame my own thinking. But I wanted to bring it to one thing, and this will show you a bit of the nerd that I am. And I think I'm in good company here. 2 fellow nerds. But I remember it was one of the Batman movies, the remakes where Batman Begins or something like that. And what happened was, at one stage, he turns the world into echolocation. So he taps into everybody's mobile phone and he basically echolocates somebody. And it came to mind when I read your brilliant idea here from 2004 of participatory Panopticon, Jamais. I love that, because I was thinking, I remember this happen. I remember the first time I saw a guy who was playing rugby at the time. It was a guy in France who was playing for this club, Toulouse in France. And one of the guys had an iPhone, and somebody had recorded him out on a night out. And I was like, oh, that's dangerous. And you wrote about this in 2004, 3 years before the iPhone hit the stage big time. So let's share a bit about this, because this doesn't help, because that plus Gen AI, and then where we can actually generate things that didn't happen, including the deep fake stuff. And we're only on the cusp of how good that's getting.
Right. Yeah. I first wrote about the participatory Panopticon, which is really fun to say. First wrote about the participatory Panopticon in 2004. gave a big talk on it in 2005. And the idea was that we are moving towards, or at least at that time, we are moving towards a world where everyone can carry around an always-on networked camera. And that just at the time, that was just a mind-blowing idea. Now it's something that everybody has in their pocket. And it is something that we didn't think about, or very few of us were thinking about the consequences of what happens, not just to the technology, the infrastructure, and not just what happens to our economies, but what happens to our relationships, whether political or social. What does it mean when you can record everything and can do so easily and can do so without it being noticed? And this isn't just the surveillance from cameras being put up everywhere in shopping malls. It's the surveillance, S-O-U-S, the bottom-up watching that comes from everyone having cameras everywhere. And, what leapt out to me at the time was that there's a real serious political development that was beginning, that the ability to record people and document what they say. And I went on with that in my own writing. I wrote about something that I called, trying to be clever, the participatory Decepticon, which, for those of you who recognize the Transformers robots, those are the bad guys. The participatory Decepticon, when you have...
You were safe in fellow nerds.
Yep. What happens when you have all of these technologies, but you also have the ability to make believable things, when you can deceive people easily and convincingly? One of the things that you get is a world where you can't believe anything. People sometimes call that the liar's dividend, where it's not so much that you're trying to make people believe something that's wrong, or something that's false. You're trying to make them doubt something that's true. And that is, I wrote about that years ago, but I think it's something that we're all facing right now. And it's very much part of the A in B.A.N.I. It's very much part of a world where we can't trust our systems, because it is so easy to create the illusion of something good, something bad, something weird, and have that be completely believable. We may come up with little tells, little hints like, oh, look, they have a lot of M dashes, so it must have been written by ChatGPT. The reality is that even if that is the case, or was the case, that's going to get eliminated pretty quickly. And in every case, the things that we treat that allow us to make up new realities, we are increasingly able to make those realities utterly immersive and convincing. And that is a real serious dilemma, because it really underscores one of the core arguments of this whole book, is that certainty is dangerous in the B.A.N.I. world. Believing yourself to be certain about something is you're putting yourself at enormous risk. Clarity is a lot more important than certainty.
I have loads more on anxious, but I'm going to keep going. One of the A's was the AMOC, which, oh man, yeesh. that really nearly tipped me over the edge. That was a tough one to read, and I'm not going to go there. I'll leave that for people who get a copy of the book to read that. So we're going to move on to nonlinear. And in a nonlinear world, you tell us, basic beliefs about cause and effect no longer seem true. Disproportionality is the rule, whether in scale, scope, or time. Key systems groan under the weight of imbalances of power or wealth. Enormous efforts seem to elicit minuscule results, while haphazard online videos or viral jokes shake up corporate boardrooms and international markets. COVID-19 was an object lesson in non-linearity, but ended up being so enmeshed in political struggles that we risk another pandemic being even worse. Whatever illusions we held about it, predictable systems and reliable outcomes are well gone. This is another difficult one, not as much so as anxiety, but let's give your take on nonlinear.
Nonlinear is actually a term from mathematics, so we're not using it in that way necessarily here. It is this idea of disproportionality, of disconnection between cause and effect. The process that led me towards including nonlinear in the original BANI formulation is something called climate hysteresis, which is a measurable lag between changes in greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere and changes to temperature and precipitation. So you can add stuff to the atmosphere and it will be 5 to 10 to 20 years, depending on all sorts of little fiddly details, but 5 to 20 years until you actually see the consequence. But it also means you can take stuff out of the atmosphere. You can stop adding stuff to the atmosphere and conditions will continue to worsen for 5 to 10 to 20 years. On top of that, it's the recognition, we have to recognize that our climate system is such that even if we stop putting out any greenhouse gases into the atmosphere right now, completely eliminate all human emissions, even after that time of continued warming for 5 to 10 years, it doesn't get cooler. We stay at that higher temperature. A lot of people think that if you stop doing something bad, things get better. Well, all we're talking about doing right now with our climate plans, COP30 in Brazil this last week, everything we're talking about simply just stops making things worse as the ultimate goal. None of it is around making things better. And so we have in this nonlinearity, this underlying condition of nonlinearity in so many of our systems where the effort that we put in, the changes that we make are completely out of balance with the results that we get, the consequences of those actions. And sometimes it's because we put in a lot of effort and get very little. Sometimes we put in a small amount of effort, an accidental change, and we see enormous consequences. Bob and I have done some work in the past around organizations that are looking at the future of advertising. And there is a cliche in that world of 50% of all advertisements are effective. You just don't know which 50%. But that is in many ways a lesson in nonlinearity. You can't tell what action you take that's going to have the effect that you want. You have to make guesses, you have to play out scenarios, but you can't be certain. And so nonlinearity is really an attempt to underscore the lack of certainty, the lack of clarity as well about how a cause leads to an effect. And so the danger of nonlinearity is, of course, you put in a lot of money and effort and time into something and get no result or little result. But it's also very much the potential for putting a lot of effort or making some serious changes to your lives and not seeing a result for a period of time. So I talked about climate hysteresis. I immediately saw that not only was it a geophysical issue, an issue around climate and environment, it was a political issue. Because the changes that we would ask people to make in order to get down to zero human emissions, the enormous changes of, essentially stop eating beef entirely around the world, stop eating ranched meats of most types, stop driving cars, or at least driving as much, stop doing international air travel, or at least using it as much. All of these things, changes to our lifestyles that many of us would see as detrimental, seeing as degrading our lives if we can't travel, if we can't have a nice juicy steak or hamburger. And then nothing gets better. In fact, things keep getting worse. You've asked us, you've forced us, you've convinced us to make all of these massive changes to our lives, and it didn't seem to matter. Things keep getting worse. And so there's a lot of trust that gets ripped away in that kind of environment. Nonlinearity is very hazardous to trust because you think you know what the outcome's going to be and you're wrong. Or you don't even imagine that there's going to be an outcome. You think it's just a casual comment I mean, the whole J.D. Vance and couch joke that were happening during the election in 2024 came about as somebody made an offhand joke on Twitter. It was really just an offhand joke that snowballed so quickly and so pervasively that even without having mentioned the details, I would say that 90% of your audience knows exactly what I'm talking about. The dangers, so the risks around nonlinearity are from that level of unpredictability and the inability to rely on our expectations. And we forget just how much of our lives revolve around the assumptions that things will turn out the way they have in the past. And we can't make that assumption.
The line that I come away with is lines themselves are a danger. We should do fewer lines and more cycles. So as futurists, we always talk about foresight, insight, action. The kind of old-fashioned predictive futurists were thinking in lines and saying, well, what's the prediction of what's going to happen? Well, you can't predict the future, but you can cycle foresight, insight, action and keep developing your thinking. But basically, if you think about the BANI world, lines are dangerous. Circles are much better and much more powerful.
I love that, Bob. When I was reading about this, I was thinking about the things like Walter Mischel's marshmallow test, the marshmallow experiment, and the delayed gratification, and how that even breaks down when you have hysteresis and you have, I push the lever here and this thing will happen. I'm actually good at delayed gratification. I know it's going to eventually happen, and you're going, no, you keep pushing that lever for it to stay at zero, and you go, is that worth it for me? And I thought of it, there's a great guy we had on the show, and I know you're two empathy lovers. There's a book called The Age of Empathy. Franz de Waal wrote that book, a brilliant book.
Right.
And Franz was on the show, and he talked about how these macaque monkeys, and they got the monkeys to do jobs, these two monkeys, and they paid them in grapes, but he'd pay one of the monkeys with a stone, and the monkeys rejected it. They'd thrown it away, this monkey's going crazy, because fairness was so important. And I thought about all those things came to mind about this. Like you say, social media hijacks these ancient forces, these cognitive forces that we have, like if it bleeds, it leads. But also, this doesn't work. For those people who have actually realized that cause and effect, it actually doesn't work in a BANI era. And that also is difficult. That effort is for what? And it made me think of organizations and how organizations, if you're a leader and you're kind of going, oh, you know what, I'm only 2 years to retirement. Do I really want to do this big transformation effort? And then you go, well, they're human and politicians are human. What do they want to be known for? Do they want to do that work? Because it's a huge personal effort. It's huge personal effort. And usually at the expense of your own energy, your own health, your own family. So there's so much happening here that's psychological as well. The cognitive part of this is massive.
Well, I want to jump into something you said just a few seconds ago, is that cause and effect don't work. Actually, cause and effect do sometimes work. And that unpredictability is the danger, because sometimes cause and effect worked exactly as expected. And if you go into it thinking that I'm going to do this and it's not going to have a result, you might be sorely disappointed by finding out that yes, it does. And so it's that the inability to reliably predict. You should talk about, so we actually, that's one of the things that, that Bob and I and the foresight world in general, the professionals, we really try to avoid the word predict. It's a bad word because it implies certainty. And it implies, as Bob says, it implies a linearity. And we like to talk about forecasts, because forecasts we generally associate with weather. And you know that weather forecasts are never 100% right, but they point you in the right direction, hopefully. And so that's what we try to do with our work, is we're not going to be 100% right, but we want to be, well, as I say, we want to be usefully wrong. That is, we want to be able to give you a sense of where things can be going so you get a better picture of what your options, the wider set of options that you have.
It's a great point, and you're right about this, is that if I do something, I actually don't know if it even paid off or not. That's the other thing. I was like, I don't know what lever worked. It's like that. It's like,
right.
You mentioned betting, Bob. It's like in the slots where you pull the thing, the magic of maybe. Did it work? Will it work? Maybe. I don't know. And then you're like, sometimes you win, you go, I didn't even pull the lever that time. Like, I don't know what happened. So I thought we'd move on. I thought there was one term I thought was really important, and the origin of it was going right back to the 12th century with King Henry II, which is stochastic terrorism. And you mentioned Vance there, so it came to mind.
Yeah, stochastic terrorism is a relatively recent term for a very old phenomenon. We talk about, you mentioned King Henry, so will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? He didn't actually call for any of his knights to go off and kill Archbishop Thomas Becket, but they took that from his statement. So stochastic terrorism means the statistical likelihood that somebody will respond to an ambiguous statement in a way that can be seen as terrorism. So saying something along the lines of, well, we don't like that, and folks out there with guns might have something to say about that. Not calling for anyone to do anything awful. They might even follow up by saying, but of course, none of you would do that. It can still be that trigger. And if you're talking to enough people and you say things enough times in a particular way, there's an increasing likelihood that somebody will act. So stochastic terrorism is this idea that you can instigate a terrorist act without actually calling for it, simply by implying that there may be a benefit from it. And I think we see that quite often. It fits nicely with the anxious model of how we make use of cognitive processes. People they leap to their own conclusions about what you really meant. And so we keep putting out statements that sound like they imply more than they're really saying, because people respond to that. And this just and in a world where you can communicate with everyone else on the planet, it gets really dangerous when you do that.
And we see a lot of gaslighting of truth speakers and ostracization of them, and they just give up. I mean, journalists, we see it all the time, they're targets of this type of thing. But we'll move on to the last one, because we want to finish the BANI and part one, which is incomprehensible. And you start this by saying, in an incomprehensible world, we hold on to less and less understanding of why we get certain outcomes, and they're all interlinked, as you'll see. Our world reveals itself to be unthinkable and senseless and absurd. We build tools to help us think, only to find out that they lie to us. We make life-changing decisions driven by ephemeral whims and trends. We are overwhelmed by information without any consistent method of finding meaning. Any capacity we have to think about the future is undermined relentlessly by chaotic fire hoses of dubious facts and confusing pseudo-patterns. Our illusions of understanding what is going on get ripped away. Beautifully written, but not such a beautiful concept.
Incomprehensible. When I first started talking about BANI more publicly, I got a lot of pushback at first around the phrasing of incomprehensible. It's almost insulting to me as a human being to imply that I can't understand something, or that human beings couldn't understand something. And that's not what incomprehensible means. We're not talking about not being able to understand what is happening. It's all about not being able to understand why. These are situations where your response is, in many cases, a less polite form of what the heck. And we see examples of this where things just don't make sense, at least to many of us. There is a wave of Gen Z-driven protests around the world that have actually brought down one government already and are threatening a couple of others, all in the developing world, that are centered around a particular anime. All of the symbolism, all of the clothing that the protesters wear, the signs that they hold up are centered around a particular anime. And I'm blanking on the name of it, and I'll come up with it in the middle of our conversation later on. But it is a fairly popular anime, but it's anime. And yet it's become the unifying factor, the unifying symbology for literally millions of people around the world as a mechanism of protest and a mechanism of political action. And that's the kind of thing that falls into the incomprehensibles. What the hell is going on here? And it is, we see this time and again with all of these different developments. Why the U.S. Centers for Disease Control just today changed their website to say that there's no evidence to support the statement that vaccines do not cause autism. That kind of thing is just absurd. And so when we talk about incomprehensible, we're talking about these absurdities. We're talking about the things that are unthinkable, that we just we can't wrap our heads around, the possible consequences of nuclear war. I mean, we just passed the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nearly everyone who witnessed that is dead. We will, over the course of the next couple of decades, lose everyone who has ever seen an above ground nuclear weapons explosion. We're losing that visceral sense of reality. And all we have are really bad special effects. I don't know if you saw Oppenheimer, but the version of the atomic bomb that blew up at the beginning of Oppenheimer was ludicrously bad.
Yeah, it'll get better and better.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. Well, the point being that there are so many things that are happening that are so overwhelming, are so ridiculous, are so just, unthinkable, absurd, wrong, that it gets very difficult to do anything, to make any kind of realistic plans, to make any kind of have any kind of real thoughts about where to go next in our lives when there's so much absurdity happening around us. And then you add to that stuff like, the AI being put into everything, but Microsoft has just enabled Copilot in every version of Windows that they keep it turned off because they're warning that turning it on might pose a security threat. But they still put it into every version of Windows, every copy of Windows. What?
Yeah.
The incomprehensible is the one part of BANI that renders me unable to speak coherently.
For those people who couldn't see Jamais there, he's showing his frustration on screen. Bob, you were going to come in there.
It's just a puzzle. I mean, and the whole emphasis on why it may be different for each of us depending on our beliefs and our values. But certainly for most of us, we have these moments of bewilderment. And that's what this is about. And it's a bridge into, I think, discussion, the positive BANI. What we're teaching here about this is that even if you have this feeling of, I don't know what's going on, there still are reasonable things you can do that probably won't correct the problem, but they'll certainly have the possibility of making it better. And they'll certainly have the possibility of you being more able to cope, more resilient yourself. And just to link back to the word Jamais used early, this is all about resilience. This is really a conversation about resilience.
Beautiful. And I think it's a nice way to bookend on this episode as well. There's a few things that came to mind as well. And I think this is the whole idea of having an acronym like this, like VUCA, like BANI, is to help you make sense of things. And
yes,
it reminded me of so many movies. The incomprehensibility. when I watch something like that movie, Don't Look Up, which is about climate change, and actually about just craziness about mining the planet and mining an asteroid as it comes for the planet to blow us up, and then 0 Day. I don't know if you saw that. Robert De Niro plays an ex-president, and it's actually about CrowdStrike. That's what it's about. It shows what happens when there's a cyber attack that takes out everything, even for seconds, and how many people die. And I think, there's an intention behind making those movies is just to wake us up, because maybe the person making the movie is going, you know what, this is incomprehensible. Why is nobody listening to me? And I know a lot of people, and you guys are those people as well, trying to get people to see that future and hope you're wrong, as you said. But I love to quote this. My fellow countryman George Bernard Shaw said, "All progress depends on the unreasonable man." And you two are unreasonable men, and we're grateful that you are as well. Last question is, where can people find you? And don't forget, we're going to come back. We're going to do a part 2, which is the BANI Plus, which is in a way, the antidote to BANI. But where is the best place to find you, Jamais?
Well, actually, right now, I have put together a website called ageofbani.com. Age of BANI, which includes connections to all 3 of the authors' bios, as well as videos that we've made explaining BANI in more detail, and a link to where to buy the book. But you can reach us through all 3 of us through ageofbani.com.
And Bob, is the future work? You're still firing away, working with lots of organizations?
Oh, yeah. So Institute for the Future is also a link for both of us. But to get more background, to buy the book, is the website that Jamais mentioned, and you can put a link in that. That'd be great.
All links, all stuff we talked about will be there. And it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining for us. Part 1 of Navigating the Age of Chaos, a sense-making guide to a BANI world that does not make sense. Jamais Cascio, Bob Johansen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Navigating the Age of Chaos. It is thanks to our friends at Kyndryl. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more at Kyndryl.com. And don't forget, check out the Kyndryl Institute. A ton of thought leadership from brilliant speakers, brilliant thinkers from all over the world, many of whom have been guests on the show. And you can find them at Kyndryl.com/institute.